Welcome to the Mutual Aid Working Group plenary session. I'm Karen Stupski. This is a pre-recorded session, so if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat button, which is located below in the center, and we will answer them live as the presentation plays. The members of our working group are Danny Leonardo, Joe Nesbitt, Karen Stupski, Kiala Young, Kimberly Doherty, Corrine Brennan, Zev Friedman, and Ulysses Archie also participated. Zev and Corrine are the main presenters for this session, as they have been working more intensively in the area of mutual aid. We hope you enjoy this session, and we look forward to having a conversation with you at the end.
Everyone, so my name is Zev Friedman, and I live in Western North Carolina in the Appalachian Mountains, about an hour outside of Asheville, in the ancestral homeland of the Catawba Nation, just outside the territory of the Cherokee, in the Taylor Creek watershed, which drains down to the Broad River and then out to the port at Charleston, South Carolina. And I live at a place called Earth Haven Eco Village, and which I'll speak to more in a moment. I'm also developing, along with a team and a community, a mutual aid network in Western North Carolina called Cooperate WNC. And I want to start off by talking about my personal experience with mutual aid and how I think that it is an instinct that is native to all humans, but which can also be developed to a much more kind of refined and sophisticated level, much like music can be. I have my 13-week-old nephew living in my house along with my sister and her partner, and I get to see how he responds to music, and he bops his head and waves his arms around when we start playing music. And so that's an instinctive awareness of rhythm that's in him. And yet he can also develop that instinct to a refined form when he gets older by studying music and by learning from musical lineages that are thousands of years old. So it's both an instinct, something that's really primal, and also something that can be developed to a very high level. And so mutual aid is like that. We've all got it in our ancestries. I think it's something that we gravitate towards, at least most of us. And it's something that has been developed to a very refined level and then lost in most cases at this point in the history of the earth, but which we can regrow. And so for me personally, living at Earth Haven has been kind of my training ground in mutual aid. Earth Haven Eco Village is an intentional community that's like I was saying, an hour outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And the whole Eco Village movement comes out of the permaculture movement, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And I think that that's part of our instinct. It was the permaculture movement reaching towards mutual aid when we developed the Eco Village kind of wave. And Earth Haven has been really lucky in that it started in the mid-90s when land prices hadn't been driven up by gentrification as much in Western North Carolina. And so many things here are characteristics of mutual aid, which is mutual aid turns out to be this kind of constellation of characteristics, not just an easy thing to define, but everything from the way the land was purchased here through people cooperatively pooling and then borrowing money from friends. No banks were involved in the land purchase, to how the childcare is done here, how birth happens here, how elders get old and are taken care of, how sick people get taken care of, how we die and bury our dead here, to how we finance projects, buildings, businesses, dealing with emergencies, new bridges, cooperative housing, cooperative farming, all kinds of different types of cooperative farming going on here. Disaster response, how we create safety through numbers, from violence, that is, and that kind of safety. Skill sharing and mentoring, emotional support and relational support. All of these things are common characteristics of kind of mutual aid culture that we have developed here over 26 years or so. And so for me, that's feels like my own training ground and the closest experience I have to kind of intact mutual aid culture, having been here in my 8th year now. And so before that, for me, as I imagine for many people here, blood family was the closest thing we had to mutual aid. The thing about blood families is that they're not typically large enough to get that effect of scale, to have the kind of village scale 150 to 500 people that you need for an emergent mutual aid culture, and they don't have diverse enough skill sets a lot of times to do everything that's needed in that to create that effect. And really importantly, that blood families often don't have the shared value set that mutual aid societies or cultures have, that they can all go in a long multi-generational direction together. So at Earth Haven, I just want to speak specifically to one of the mutual aid things we're doing, which is a savings pool that we started. That's also one of the programs of Cooperate WNC, the regional mutual aid network. A savings pool is a group of 15 to 25 people who pool savings every month and then can make 0% interest loans to each other for projects based on proposals. It's proposal driven. So ours is focused on small business development at Earth Haven, because that's kind of a weak link in our social and economic system, is having businesses and employ people here on the land in the community. So we have folks in there who want to grow our businesses or start new businesses, and it acts as a peer mentoring group where we can test ideas and improve ideas with each other, and then have the pool of savings to make loans to each other when those are needed to develop those projects. I also now want to go to a couple other groups of people who I've been privileged to come in contact with who have more intact mutual aid cultures, and just to point you to them for further insight and inspiration. They're the people in Yucuyoko, which is in northern Oaxaca in Mexico. And those are Mixteca indigenous people. There's a book written by and about them called Milpa Seed to Salsa. And these folks are have a multi-thousand-year-old intact kind of agroecological farming system and mutual aid culture, which they're using, among other things, to fund growing from seed and planting every year about 600,000 or 700,000 trees to reforest their desertified landscape, alders and pines, which are developing new topsoil and allowing them to continue growing milpa food there. And they're funding all of this through their cooperative financing mechanisms, as well as working with an NGO called CEDICAM, CEDICAM. So it's a great example of the integration of agroecological farming methods with the culture, right? Putting the culture back in permaculture, what it takes to actually support those things. And so I've learned from them and others about how we can begin doing that and integrating the agroecology into the social and economic pieces better. And that's one of our programs with Cooperate WNC, is called Carbon Harvest. And it is a cooperative financing and cooperative agriculture program for implementing climate resilient agroforestry practices at a much larger scale than has been done so far in our region, especially silvopasture and riparian restoration projects. You can check that out on our website, on the Cooperate WNC website. And the last thing I want to speak to is two Latinx-led projects and communities who I've come in contact with in Western North Carolina. And one of them is a community of neighborhoods just outside of Asheville who have been developing out of 30 years of people living together and having shared trust. They've developed a set of housing cooperatives that have bought land with trailers on them, so they're mobile home communities, and also have started cooperative businesses and now a nonprofit and a cultural kind of preservation organization for their language and ritual ways. And that has all emerged out of shared trust and kind of track record of living and working together and informal mutual aid for a long time that created capacity over time to then develop some of these more formal enterprises that now involve a lot of money and resources and high levels of organization. And then another organization called Industrial Commons, which is a cooperative incubator that came out of a Guatemalan, mostly Guatemalan Mayan women-led business called Opportunity Threads, which is a worker-owned co-op of about 50 worker owners that does recycled and organic cotton clothing manufacturing about an hour outside of Asheville. And they were so successful that they just decided to incubate other worker-owned co-ops. So they created this nonprofit, Industrial Commons, which is the nonprofit that incubates other co-ops using a revolving loan fund financed by profits from the cooperative businesses. I just want to turn this into one last point I'm learning about, which is that there seem to be two different directions that mutual aid can come from. It can either come from what I call the cultural topsoil direction, which is like the first group I spoke about, that is, they kind of have a culture of cooperation and relationships and trust, that then that topsoil allows the individual plants, if you will, of enterprises to grow successfully out of it. Or it can come from more of the core value creation, where you have some single or a couple economic pumps that turn into the surplus and capacity to then start branching out and funding and supporting other more complex and perhaps informal operations from that. So those are kind of two broadly different directions that I see, and other people have named this pattern too, kind of cooperative and mutual aid efforts from developing from. And I'm asking us now as a kind of permaculture community to think about how that insight can apply to our communities and our efforts with permaculture mentoring and project development so far, and think about how we can apply these patterns to develop these kind of practices in our communities, which we'll be getting into more later in this webinar. The core competencies in terms of working between communities, especially what we're doing like with our network is working to create interracial alliances between what are pretty compartmentalized racial and ethnic groups in Western North Carolina, and a deep history of institutionalized oppression and racism in a lot of different ways. But some of the feedback that we've gotten working with the Latinx communities we've worked with is that they want to ally with, in our case, it's a white-led organization so far. They want to, if they're going to ally with white-led organizations or white communities, they want folks who have developed core competencies, people who have done the work ourselves to get some skill sets and some stories of success that give us something to share, so that we can be peers sharing with other peers from other communities and cultures who also have things to share. And that way it becomes a two-way, truly reciprocal relationship, rather than something that they told us that they've often experienced as being put on a pedestal by white people. And they don't want to be put on a pedestal. They want to be in peer relationships where it's an exchange of mutual reciprocity. So with that, we'll go on to the next speaker.
Hi, I'm Corinne Brennan, and I'm from Central Florida. We're here on our permaculture farm, and we are located in the Springs Coast watershed with world-class springs surrounding us, and the Withlacoochee River, the Wegiwachi, the Chassahowitzka, and we are in the hinterlands between the Tocobaga and the Appalachee tribes that were disputing this territory. And I'm going to take a little bit different tact than Zev did on this topic. I've worked in disaster response before I got into permaculture, and I continue to do some of that work afterwards. So we're going to talk about mutual aid in that context. And one of the first projects I did as a permaculture designer was in Haiti after the earthquake in 2010. And we brought some compost toilet and water filtration experts down there. That was the most life-threatening situation. And our goal was to put a more permanent culture there and share knowledge of how to use compost toilets. And since Haiti really didn't have sanitation systems very developed, so that they could capture that waste stream instead of going with the usual city sewage systems. And what we noticed when we're down there is just the strength of the neighborhoods that the Haitians had. They were very organized after the disaster. Most of the neighborhoods had organically elected representatives that acted between them and the rescue agencies. And they shared food, they shared everything very fairly, and taking care of the elderly and the pregnant women and children, and making sure they had enough. And I've noticed in a number of disaster settings when the community is already strong, which they have to be. A lot of times this is true in areas where they don't have very much, where there isn't a lot of monetary wealth. There's a lot of cooperation at that level, and there's a lot more resilience. The communities that have already formed strong communities are much, much more resilient after a disaster. In the local areas after COVID, after the shutdown, the Time Bank was a really strong center for community building. Those relationships had already been created through this exchange system, hour-for-hour exchange system. And it was really beautiful to see it go into action and to see that, again, organic organization spring into usefulness. Also, a lot of mutual aid organizations sprang up all over the country, and they have been in process from previous disasters. In New Orleans with Katrina, there's a pretty organized group of mutual aid supporters in that area. Occupy New York became Occupy Sandy after the Sandy hurricane, and they're pretty organized and on an organic level. And there's a number of other mutual aid groups. I participated in some of the conversations about COVID, and one of the things that came up with these groups is that they're very interested in creating more of a permanent culture around mutual aid. They are disaster responders, and I've talked to a lot of other disaster responders who feel the same way. There's a strong interest in preparing for disasters by creating more resilience, and most people in this industry or who have helped out in disasters recognize the advantage of mutual aid networks set up before a disaster and a strong community building before disaster. And we have the tools to do this. We haven't used a lot of our tools on invisible structure design, and I think it's time to do that. It's time for us to step up, and I'm hoping we can accomplish some of that in the summit and in the ongoing work of these working groups. One other thing I wanted to say that I felt started some mutual aid networking in our community that hadn't been there before. And one thing that we started was a salon, an online salon. And that we did because we were lonely. We were stuck in our houses and we wanted to talk to each other. So at first it was just conversation about whatever was on our minds, and it became more and more focused, and ended up in spawning some projects and some working groups and some deeper relationships on many levels. And this happened with people that we normally wouldn't get into deep conversations with, people in the next city over or across the state. And leadership in these various communities have been getting together more and having these conversations. And that's really beautiful, because we need to exchange those energies more deeply. So that's just a thought of another tool, another approach that we can use to increasing our ability to give aid to each other and to build community and to create resilience. And you know, creatively responding to change is part of this whole process. And we'll go more into that later about all the opportunities to do that. But, you know, the COVID-19, as harsh as it is for many people, has opened a lot of doors of opportunity as well. And to the degree that we use them, we can make it less harsh. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Zev back, and I'm just going to speak a little bit more to the history of mutual aid, stuff that I started to get into earlier. But mutual aid is an incredible history that we are all involved in, because, of course, the phrase mutual aid, an English phrase, is just one word or phrase that's used to describe something, but it's very ancient, and it was popularized, the term, by this guy Peter Kropotkin, who was a Russian living in the UK in the late 1800s, and he wrote this book, Mutual Aid: A Factor in Evolution. And in that book, he went through and cataloged how Darwin's own observation of organisms had documented more cooperation and mutuality than it had competition, but how the industrialists and architects of the Industrial Revolution had cherry-picked Darwin's observations in order to paint a narrative of a life that is dog eat dog and all about competition, and survival of the fittest. In fact, the fittest are those who are best able to cooperate. That's more like the definition of fitness than the best able to compete. Although truthfully, ecosystems are made of both, but cooperation is the primary pattern. And so in the first third of the book or so, he goes through Darwin's own data, cataloging all of the examples of mutualisms in ecosystems. And then the remainder of the book is him doing the same thing for human cultures and talking through culture after culture after culture, land-based people all the way to urbanized people at his time, and winnowing out all of the stories of how people have organized around what he called mutual aid, and how we've done that for a very long time, at least since the beginning of agriculture, probably long before that. But it's basically describing this this mid-scale pattern that isn't something that automatically arises necessarily in like hunter-gatherer groups, but it's something that arises when people recognize that we need a larger scale of grassroots organizing in order to do things that can't be done at the simple clan or even often village scale. And in fact, a lot of that has had to do with resisting oppression and dealing with violent forces. Mutual aid societies or networks have been used to resist oppressive governments that have been taking land and resources and violently oppressing people in everywhere from Italy to the UK, all through the Americas in modern times since the colonialists came along. Everywhere, there's all these examples of us, our ancestors, wherever they're from, all the different cultures and languages and ways, including mine, using mutual aid to resist the Nazis. It's been a way of gathering the resources, creating resilience. If you have one village burned down or all of their crops fail, they're part of a network of villages who then come in, give them seed, house people for the winter, help them to get back on their feet and establish themselves. So mutual aid provides this larger network of resilience, and it comes about through both formal and informal mechanisms, through both the kind of human instinct I was speaking about earlier to help each other out, but also through formalized agreements. And you find these incredible formalized agreements and language of mutual aid, like I was speaking earlier about the folks in Yukuyoko, the Mixtecas. They have a language around mutual aid, like we say that the indigenous folks in Siberia have around snow, right? All the words for the different types of snow. Well, in Oaxaca, they have 10 or 12 different words for the different organs of mutual aid. The types of barter, the types of communal work, there are different types of communal work and different words for them. The ways that reciprocity is tracked over decades between families, between clans, between villages. There's a sophisticated language to that, and then that contains them all within a shared and evolving framework of how people help each other out in different circumstances and different needs. Also taking into account in their case the fact that it's not a horizontal society. There is stratification of wealth, although not nearly to the degree as in some other places. But there are ways of redistributing that wealth, especially through ritual and ceremony, when wealthier people are expected to throw massive parties that feeds everybody, a party that feeds everybody for a week, and when they give away lots of wealth in the form of gifts. So mutual aid has this incredible history, but then, like so many things, we lost it when, and I'm using the we to refer to colonialists who came to the United States, what's now the United States, and obliterated to a large degree a lot of the indigenous mutual aid cultures that were going on here. But we had already had our mutual aid cultures destroyed by the last rampaging army back in Europe, the places we came from, Spain, France, the Britain, etc., Portugal. And so once that gets lost, it's one of those things like topsoil that it just takes one generation for it to be lost, and then it takes a long time to regrow it, right? It's just like topsoil. So in the US, the most powerful examples of mutual aid are those that have survived among the indigenous peoples here, and those that have come in with immigrants and with African Americans, right? So because mutual aid and cooperativism is the way that people who are oppressed and have very few resources survive. Cooperation is how we survive, just like Peter Kropotkin observed in his book. That's how we survive, cooperation. And so here in the US, it's people who've been marginalized, who have been keeping the heartbeat of mutual aid going. And I want to speak out to a book called Collective Courage, written by Dr. Jessica Gordon Nemhard, that catalogs African American mutual aid and cooperativism through the centuries, and among other things, how African American mutual aid led to the modern cooperative business movement and the creation of the credit unions, and through the intense trust and shared responsibility and resource of African American mutual aid societies, it led to the ability to organize the civil rights movement. So in many ways, that culture, that long-term dedication to the same things, gives us the capacity also to get organized politically, as well as economically, socially, and ecologically, which, by the way, a lot of mutual aid has been organized around farming and land management and land use through all cultures. Even here in the US, the Grange, that's a mutual aid society organized for farmers. So we'll stop there. Lots more there, but we'll come back to it in other examples.
Hi, my name is Joe Nisbet, and I'm going to be sharing the Montgomery Improvement Association. This is a piece of the history of mutual aid, how marginalized communities have used mutual aid to empower themselves and solve failures that the government has, that they find themselves dealing with. So the Montgomery Improvement Association is something close by to me here in Auburn, Alabama. It's Montgomery, Alabama. It was mostly active in the 50s and 60s as part of the civil rights movement. It was organized in part by Martin Luther King Jr., and this is the group that organized the Montgomery bus boycotts. And they created several successful political actions. So the beginnings of the Montgomery Improvement Association, it started when Rosa Parks was arrested, and they had a single-day protest of the bus system of Montgomery, which, as we know, was segregated, and Black and white passengers had to sit on different sides of the bus. So the protest created the Montgomery Improvement Association to organize the continued protest. They wanted it to go beyond just a single day. And so they used the existing social network of the church system in Montgomery for all of the Black congresses. And this included Minister Martin Luther King Jr. And so these people, the ministers, were given leadership in the Montgomery Improvement Association, and they regularly held meetings at churches, and they accepted donations where they paid for their own carpooling system to get protesters to the right places for all of their events. So over the year and a half after Rosa Parks was arrested through the bus boycotts, the Montgomery Improvement Association leaders received multiple death threats, and this included the white people that were helping to ally with the Black protesters. So the MIA actually gained in strength and popularity after some of these horrendous acts were committed. And that's because the MIA gave donators anonymity, and they received a lot more support due to how unfairly they were being treated. Over time, they increased the responsibility of what the group was managing. So more than just the protests on the bus system, they set on the goal to overall improve race relations with the city of Montgomery. And they started several lawsuits with the NAACP, and they formed a delegation to negotiate with the city. They also began producing a newsletter that had a national reach, and they got many different donations from this. And a key part of the entire organization were the Black women that were really important to this movement, because they were feeding people, they were housing people, and they were the ones that were strengthening and encouraging the protest in a way that is not often recognized, but is important to the mutual aid function of the group. So this is Georgia Gilmore, and her kitchen became the 24/7 safe space of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and she sold food to pay for donations to the people who were carpooling protesters, earning more than $100 each week. And that's a picture of some of the food that she cooked. So the result of this group is that after a year of boycotting, the Supreme Court decided in favor and integrated the bus system in Montgomery, which is a huge win in the legacy of the civil rights movement. The Montgomery Improvement Association went on to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they continued with other campaigns for race relations and equity, including voter registration, the March from Selma to Montgomery, integrating the public schools, and integrating city parks. And today the group is still active. They're still marching, and they're still working together, creating community around a common purpose for marginalized Black people in Montgomery. And for our group, the important lessons are that mutual aid solutions are extremely important, and sometimes the only support that a marginalized community might have when you're marginalized by the actual government or the market system. These non-traditional systems of support might be the only thing people have. Another thing is the leadership of this group was based off of existing leadership in the community, which was through the churches and where the people were already meeting, which was at the churches. having good food and creating safe meeting space was essential. And maybe that's something that becomes even more important with COVID-19 and this, Zoom only era. But really the frequency of the meetings and the frequency that they were able to share donations, information, and move flexibly and adaptably through these frequent meetings really encouraged their success. And well-organized groups that are started for a single goal can naturally evolve into a permanent effort, which is important with some of the single concept groups that have been formed around COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter today. Thank you.
The Asian American immigrants have faced hostile environments to their participation in the mainstream economy, either because of exclusionary legislation or because they lack paperwork. The standard line about immigrants is that through hard work and perseverance, they'd pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But actually, Asian American immigrants have not only survived, but also thrived because of these cooperative institutions that they brought with them. For example, in the late 1970s and early 80s, the Vietnamese boat people began to arrive in the States. Of nearly 2.3 million refugees, the U.S. accepted about 400,000. These, by and large, became part of the Vietnamese refugee communities that emerged across the U.S. and still have a strong presence today. In fact, post-Katrina, much of the rebuilding work was actually done by the children of the original Mekong Delta refugees that had settled in New Orleans 25 years before. Their survival has been dependent on cooperation and community, or what they call Kyongdong, that held them together. If you need to borrow money or buy a car, someone would find a way to make it happen. That cooperation has led to the creation of cooperative-led value chains in the textile and fashion industries today. But the boat people were not unique in the Asian American experience of arriving stateside. Cooperation and mutual aid have been hallmarks of the Asian American experience ever since the earliest documented examples of immigration. Collectively, it took the form of family associations and rotating credit practices. Early Chinese immigrants who arrived in San Francisco were met at the pier by representatives of family associations who would escort the new arrivals to the association building and provide housing. The associations also connected immigrants to employment and provided basic social insurance for their membership. This might include medicine, burial expenses, and money for travel back to China for the indigent elderly. Membership was open to the descendants of a particular clan, or even broader, those who shared some regional affiliation in China. Family associations and benevolent societies weren't unique to immigrants from Asia. Germans also had a version, Landsmannschaft, that supported students from the same part of the country studying abroad. However, what made these institutions particularly useful was in the context of political exclusion. The Chinese were barred from entering into the U.S. if they were common laborers. Immigrants are only admitted if they could prove that they were merchants, scholars, or diplomats under the Exclusion Act of 1882. In addition, trade unions at that time pitted white workers against Chinese workers who were portrayed as docile and susceptible to the boss's whims. To counter this, mutual aid associations provided benefits for members with shared ancestry and family. Cooperatives later flourished in a broader American communities because this exclusionary laws initially passed to restrict the Chinese immigration were eventually applied to all Asians. Filipinos, for example, started arriving in California in large numbers in the 1930s. These workers organized themselves as informal cooperatives under a leader from the same region who spoke the same language. That leader would be responsible for getting farm jobs for his cooperatives and providing accommodations for the new arrivals. Members of the cooperative could borrow money without interest in the winter when seasonal farm work was at a standstill. Cooperative members might also provide childcare for other community members. The parents of these children might be working long hours and low-wage service jobs, such as nail salons, and wouldn't be available to drop off and pick up their kids from school. So in addition to childcare, it wasn't uncommon for caretakers to also provide meals for the parents to pick up along with their children at the end of their shifts. This is how these informal cooperatives became kind of a loose mutual aid network. Asian American immigrants also pooled financial resources to help each other out because, like many immigrants, they faced obstacles to participating in the mainstream banking and financial institutions. This might be because they didn't have access to financial information that the banks required, or it could be due to strong language barriers or distrust of banks, or simply not having enough money to save. The FDIC recently found that more than 20% of Asian Americans are underbanked, or in other words, they've turned to alternative financial services in the past year. One example of that would be rotating credit associations, whose members grew up in the same region or attended the same school, and who contribute a fixed amount of money to a fund which is then distributed at intervals to each member in turn. Each culture has its own form of these organizations. The Chinese call them huis or kos. In Japan, it's a tanamoshi or mujin. The Koreans have keis. The Indonesians have arisans. And the Indians call them chits or curries. In more modern history, nail salon workers, for instance, are primarily recent female immigrants, which mean that most of them don't have a history of work experience in their home countries and may lack the legal paperwork to live in the U.S. and open a U.S. bank account. So in a recent study of nail salon workers in New York City, published by the International Migration Review, they found that many participate in these lending circles in order to pay for household expenses, children's college tuition, and even mortgage and rent payments. In addition to sharing money, the associations also help bridge the social isolation and the stress that low-wage workers often face. Cooperative practices sometimes originate in the ancestral country and get replicated in the U.S. For example, a farmers' cooperative in rural Taiwan would pool their money to purchase seeds every year for harvest. So when one of the children of the co-op's founder later immigrated to the U.S. to study and ended up purchasing a large cotton farm in Lubbock, Texas, she converted it into an organic farm that's now a hub for organic agriculture. It supports edible school gardens, donates produce to the local food bank, and offers shares in a local CSA. Her daughter, who's become a community organizer and works as a coordinator for Solidarity Economy in St. Louis, said that the goal is to make the solidarity economy movement for people like her mom, who doesn't just consider herself a social justice organizer, but is clearly doing the things that the rest of the younger generation is talking about. So although cooperative economies have been practiced out of necessity by Asian American immigrants as a way to survive, there's definitely lessons that all communities can draw from.
Hi, I'm Karen Stupski, and I'm going to talk about intentional communities and mutual aid. An intentional community is basically a group of people who choose to live together cooperatively and share resources. So it's a wonderful way to practice mutual aid, day in and day out. I'm going to share the case study of the intentional community where I live and where I have lived for 27 years. And that community is called Heathcote. It's located in Maryland. So it's a very small community. We currently only have about 5 to 6 adults and 3 children living on the land, as well as a few very active non-resident members. But it's a 55-year-old community, so it's lasted a long time. And over the years, at its peak, we probably had about 15 adults and 6 kids living on the land. But one of the things that has enabled us to practice mutual aid very well is that we use consensus as our decision-making process. And so that's a method that enables every voice to be heard and takes everyone's needs into consideration. And it's a process of caring. So we try to make decisions that are going to help to meet everyone's needs. One type of mutual aid that we practice is that we're part of a community land trust. And that is what gives us access to the land. The name of our community land trust is School of Living, and it holds 532 acres of land in trust in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. And within the land trust, there are 6 intentional communities. And Heathcote is one of them. So Heathcote has about 44 acres. And most of us would not be able to afford that land if we had to buy it on our own. So by joining an intentional community that's part of a community land trust, we're able to get access to land by having that held as a community resource. Another community resource that we own collaboratively is buildings. This is a picture of the Heathcote Mill, which is an old grain mill that is used as both a residence and a community center. We also own a farmhouse collaboratively, and we built a straw bale house together, which was owned by the community for many years. So by owning the housing together, we're able to provide housing at a very affordable cost to our members. We also own other things together like tools, furniture, and farm infrastructure. In addition, we grow a lot of our food together. We have quite a few community gardens, and the way that we've organized it has changed over the years. At times there were, several different gardeners who each grew food in different places, and then the community members that weren't gardening would pay in and pay the farmers a little stipend. And now we just have one farm, and it's a CSA. We have shareholders within and outside of the community. And so any community members that want food can participate in that CSA. We also, over the years, have done a lot of shared meals together. We have our food co-op is called Grandmother Moon, and one source of the food in that co-op is the farm. But we also, when we pool our money into the food co-op, we do a weekly order from a monthly order from a whole food distributor where we buy in bulk. And then we have a weekly shopper who will go out and just pick up what is needed from week to week. So most of us do not have to do any shopping. And then we cook collaborative meals together that we eat. For most of the years, we've had 5 or 6 community meals every week. And that's a great way to get great home cooked food. And usually each member would only have to cook once every week or two. Now we've scaled back, being that we're smaller. And so we only have the potlucks now. So how we've practiced our mutual aid around food has changed over the years. Another way that we support each other is by working together. Each community member contributes about 5 to 9 hours of community labor per week, doing things like chores, cleaning, attending meetings, cooking, managerships, committee work, etc. So by working together, we're able to support each other very well. And we also play together, whether it's music, sing-alongs, campfires, game nights. By playing together, that's another way that we can meet an essential need that we all have. Some other ways we've practiced mutual aid are by some of the kids have homeschooled together. Some of the parents have shared childcare and taken care of each other's kids while one couple would go out on a date night. We've also done car sharing and done different kinds of loans to support members when they're having a financial hard time. So through all this mutual aid, we've been able to provide a good quality of life for our members at less cost. And some of our members have a low income and some are affluent, but by sharing and supporting each other, we're able to provide for all at a very reasonable cost. So that's just one example of how mutual aid can work in an intentional community context.
Why mutual aid now? We're all really aware of the stresses on our society and the potential for greater problems. We're facing disasters all over the U.S., natural disasters and COVID and all these different things. Climate change is the big slow-mo disaster that's affecting many of us acutely at different times. But it's easy to set aside in our daily lives and not really plan for it. And we're not going to do this by ourselves. It's just not going to work. We're not going to sit on our homesteads and be okay. We need to work together. We need to create much deeper networks. We need to cooperate much more deeply. It's not going to happen unless we do that. We would be violating our basic permaculture principles on an invisible structure scale if we don't do this. And this is something that we've had discussions about, and I'm sure many people have, is we're pretty darn good at applying permaculture principles to the visible structures, to the land, and but we haven't really dived in very deeply on applying them to invisible structures in many areas. Some people are doing better than others, but we have a long way to go. We have a lot of upside there, especially from the viewpoint of scaling up. And we're hoping this summit is going to accomplish some of that. But I'm really appreciative of what mutual aid networks have accomplished and looking at those examples, because we can learn a lot from them. There's a lot of permaculture principles being applied to those examples. So some of the elephants in the room are, climate change, slow-mo disaster. We have COVID, which is kind of an exercise and a drill for bigger disasters that are headed our way. How do we respond? How strong are our networks? Where are the weak points? We're finding those out, and people are coming together and handling it with mutual aid. For instance, educating our kids. A lot of kids still can't go back to school, and people are spontaneously creating these homeschool groups and figuring it out. And we need to we can apply our permaculture principles to making that even more resilient. Social justice is a major concern right now, and it's always an issue, but it's in our faces, and that gives us an opportunity to weave design solutions in to address that while addressing these other issues, because all these other issues are going to impact people of color and communities that are on the edge much more than middle-class people. Economic systems are very stressed right now in a lot of areas, and the basic unsustainability of these systems is becoming very, very obvious even to some very middle-class types of people. This is another opportunity for us because we can bring in these concepts of regenerative economies. A lot of people are receptive to this. They want answers. They know they can see the cracks in the system. So we have a lot of opportunities right now, and mutual aid, I feel, is a real core part of the answer. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's Zev again, and I was asked to speak to what our working group has been doing approaching the summit and kind of our vision for where we might collectively take this toolkit and culture of mutual aid in our communities and in the permaculture movement. And this is really juicy and exciting stuff. I worked with PINA to create a webinar on this, which is available on the PINA website last year. And this is personally, for me, huge, where my passion is coming out of permaculture and agroecology before going into mutual aid organizing. So we have a number of different ideas here. I think the general overarching theme is that mutual aid organizing for the permaculture movement could be as much about how we do things as what we do. It's the idea that there could be that maybe we've been failing to catch and store energy in some certain ways in the kind of mode by which we've been doing permaculture organizing. And Bill Mollison's, kind of spoke to this in a designer's manual and the later chapters where he talked about larger scale cultural and bioregional organizing. But it's also been something that's been so daunting to, I think, many permaculture practitioners, especially the white permaculture practitioner predominant statistics in the US, that permaculture has largely been relegated to a homesteading identity, and eco villages have been an exception to that, but we haven't done that effective of a job at focusing on the long-term cultural and relationship development. And just to run really quick story and then go into this our kind of ideas that 4 years ago, I did a questionnaire out to all my permaculture design and education clients and students from 13 years of teaching and doing consulting, and to see where they were at now, what they were doing. And out of the landowners, the ones who responded back, less than half of them still lived on the properties they had hired me to help them do designs for. And the take-home point that I took from that, because there were all these different reasons: their families fell apart, they moved to take care of an elder parent, they decided they hated farming, they ran out of money and had to get a job, all these different things. But for me, the theme I boiled it down to is people didn't have the cultural and economic support systems that it takes to support long-term land use systems, right? We're designing a permaculture system for 100 or 150 years. Well, what cultural and economic systems does it take to take care of the people while we're doing that, and to have the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and responsibility to even care for a project like that? So that's kind of where I'm coming from, is, and not to speak too much for our group, but I think there's some sense of that too in our group, of like, there's a whole other dimension of cultural continuity here that we could do a lot better at, and that's where mutual aid comes in. So a few of the tools that we could bring to bear: there's something called asset-based community development, ABCD. This is a body of grassroots organizing coming out of Chicago, and study of kind of how different communities around the world have done grassroots organizing to figure out what needs to happen in a community, and then get the resources to do it. And this is something, it's related to asset mapping, but it's much more action oriented, and it's based on the belief that a community, whatever size community, has assets within it, even if they look poor to a kind of industrial eye. They have tremendous assets in terms of all kinds of things, usually land and buildings, and certainly knowledge and skills and relationships. And so asset-based community development focuses on the assets rather than the deficiencies. It asks first, what are our strengths? And then, what do we need? And then how can we apply those strengths to what we need? And then out of a series of one-on-one interviews where community members interview each other and gain insights on what our strengths are and what we need, actions organically emerge out of that. And so rather than having a few point people who are trying to kind of beat the drum and get stuff going, although there's certainly still that needed in certain ways, it develops actions organically out of community needs and abilities. This is something that we could do training on. This institute in Chicago offers trainings. One idea is to do a training with permaculture professionals from around North America in the next 6 months or 9 months, where we get skilled up on ABCD and then can take that back to our communities and act as a peer mentoring group for each other remotely as we're going through those processes in our own communities to tease out the best actions to take. Another thing that we think is a priority where we are in Western North Carolina, and I would guess is in many other places, is developing cooperative healthcare. And this is a primary unmet need, as probably everyone here knows, for many people and communities: access to high quality, especially holistic healthcare, but also emergency and conventional healthcare. And there are models all around the world, and some in the US, for doing that cooperatively. And this is something that is left almost entirely out of permaculture, in my experience, is human health. There's maybe herbalism and a little bit of kind of holistic general knowledge, but in terms of how do we really deal with very sick people? How do we deal with Lyme's disease? How do we deal with COVID, right? How do we deal with cancer? How do we deal with people who are very old and need frequent medical attention? Those are real issues in many of our lives. If we can't get real with that, we can't actually live our lives and do these projects. So there could be some collaboration among some of us who are doing permaculture organizing to really look at what could a cooperative healthcare association look like, and sharing that knowledge between regions. Another idea of a direction we could take this is a reboot of a permaculture credit union. And this is something, as many of you know, that was tried in New Mexico and Santa Fe, and didn't succeed. And in my opinion, that's because the time wasn't ripe and because it wasn't done at a collaborative enough scale. And I think we could try again and do it much better and have a serious funding organ for fair interest loans investment into scaled up and community supported permaculture projects. Another idea is doing a more general, there was the ABCD idea, but doing a more general North American mutual aid and permaculture organizing cohort with folks from this kind of summit leadership environment, working together for a year or so to do deep learning around all of these tools and develop action plans that could still involve ABCD, probably would, in our own places, as well as other tools like savings pools, like cooperative healthcare organizing. And one last idea that we spoke to that I'll bring up is, which I think this is a very powerful one, the possibility of conjoining the notion, the PINA notion of hubs with the notion of physical mutual aid community centers, places that are multifunctional community centers. Could be someone's house, could be a church, could be a municipal community center, could be a bookstore or a restaurant with a big meeting space in the back that serve multiple functions, including things like healthcare clinics, childcare, acting as pickup points for purchasing cooperatives to save everybody money and create kind of group negotiating power and purchasing. So, how can PINA hubs not only be hubs of permaculture, mentoring and information spread and kind of permaculture design practice and farming? Those things are all great, but also act as hubs for true people care, for taking care of people and all of our needs, which also helps to create a magnetism and momentum, economic and social momentum for participation. So these are some of the topics that we're offering that could be subjects of deep dive in the workshops coming up too. All right, thanks everybody for your interest and see you soon.
Hello, my name is Joe Nisbet, and as this group has been working through some ideas and a vision of where we would like to go, one of the things that I wanted to bring up to the conversation was the idea of these working groups that we've been using to create the NOWS Summit, that these are a new structural support for mutual aid within the PINA network. So these working groups are going to continue beyond the conference and into the future. And what this means for mutual aid is that these working groups are creating frequent flows of communication between members. So the frequency of communication is a really necessary component of effective mutual aid. And the reason for that is that we need to see and speak to each other to understand each other's needs and understand the community as a whole's needs in the best way that we can provide ourselves to serve the community. So these working groups are the new method or the new structural support that we're going to be using to enable this frequent communication. And this is going to allow, once we understand the community and we can begin to offer our services more effectively, it's going to enable more mutual-based solutions to be provided through PINA. So I can speak to just personally what these working groups have meant to me is they have allowed me to interface with PINA, the organization, and to meet with PINA members more than I ever have before. So I can really appreciate the time that I've spent in all these different working groups. And if you think about the mutual aid picture of an organization, the trust and the social connections between the members, that's the topsoil. So are we eroding or regenerating our topsoil? And through the working groups, PINA is enabling us to build deeper and deeper connections with each other and build that topsoil of trust and social connection.
So one of the things that we did as a working group is we had a discussion about what kind of toolkits could we create for mutual aid. There's a lot of toolkits out there that already exist, people who have done successful things over the years and really kind of honed down what those things are that could be replicated from place to place. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of these and where we're at with them and what help we might need that you might be able to provide. The first one is a mutual aid resource, kind of database or list. And we've started this. It's in Google Drive. It's a public doc. Anyone can contribute to it, access it, and use it. And it's just in the beginning stages, but already there's some pretty hefty information about the state of mutual aid in North America and some things that you can access if you want to get more involved. And another toolkit we'd like to make is food rescue, food share. How can we create more food flexibility and resilience in our communities? And a food shed is another concept. An asset map of the food shed would be very valuable, and that's part of this ABCD process of, you know, figuring out what your assets are in the area. And these tools can be plugged in once you do that ABCD. This is what you can utilize to actually get somewhere now that you know the needs and the resources. Another toolkit could be seed and plant sharing, and there's some really creative ways of doing this. One of our favorite in our area is a music and art event that includes seed sharing. So this attracts a lot of people that are coming for the music and the art, but then they get introduced to plants and seeds and get to talk to the growers and learn about it and create community around that as well as the music, and people really love that. Another one is local seed banks, and you can do those at libraries. You know, and now you're creating this bank of heirloom seeds that grow really well in your area. And this is like such an important aspect of food security, local food security. And you have tool libraries, and there is software for this that already exists. So we'll be getting all that information into the folder on this topic. And there's time banks, again, that has software. They're very well developed community that you can just plug right into and get going. Another interesting toolkit is the concept of re-economy, creative economics. And one thing that happened as a result of COVID in our area is that someone who had a COVID check that they didn't really want to utilize because they didn't need it, decided to create a microloan fund with her check and with the check of some of her friends to provide to permaculture businesses. So now you have people who are out of work. They don't necessarily want to go back because they're just looking at the big picture and going, you know, what else could I do with my life? And here we have this money coming into the system. Well, let's get creative and let's capture those energies and let's use them in a regenerative design and create a bunch of regenerative businesses from it and regenerative resources of all kinds. And then also there's this concept of resilience hubs, which we'll go into a little bit more later. And these are very exciting to me. You could call them life pods, or you could call them a lot of things. And there's some libraries that are actually creating this hub in the library. It could be done from any organization. It could be done by permaculturists. It could be done by transition movement. And this is another exciting way of helping ramp up mutual aid in your area. And again, we're very interested in hearing from you as far as what kind of ideas you have for toolkits or what kind of resources you have. Thanks. Thank you for attending our plenary. And we have a few things happening this afternoon I wanted to let you know about. One of them, right after lunch or during lunch, is a needs and resources exchange. And this is going to be run by an expert facilitator that will help bring out the best in you guys and help you find those meaningful exchanges. And after that, we're going to have a workshop, and we're going to combine with the Regenerative Ag working group. We're integrating, not segregating, and we're going to be exploring opportunities and challenges of mutual aid within regenerative ag, since that's such a key thing, the food supply and the resilience of the food supply. And after we explore those things, we're going to have a design charrette, and we're really looking forward to your creative collective genius being a part of that charrette. And if you're interested in becoming a member or part of or participating in any of our working groups, you can do that. We warmly welcome you. We would love to have your assistance and your creative energy involved. And you could just contact us through the PINA website, or you can contact any of us as individuals to become a part of that group. And we also value your suggestions, your resources, your ideas, your feedback on any aspect of this. So thank you and have fun.